Welcome back to Zero and Repeater Media, and welcome to a new series we're going to call Baroque Sunbursts, a new show about music, culture, and philosophy. So for our inaugural episode, we have myself, Matt Horizon, of course, our resident messianic Marxist Labour Kyle, and we are joined, amazingly, by Ravenna Hunt-Hendrix, the artist, philosopher, theologian, and musician, most known for her seminal work with the band Liturgy. Ravenna joins us to look back upon the opening salvo of her musical philosophy, 2009's Transcendental Black Metal, a Vision of Apocalyptic Humanism. And we're going to be talking about the teeth-grinding, fist-clenching experience of musical intensity, the blast beat and its discontents, and how ideas spanning from Christology to Nietzsche and German Idealism have inspired her work up until today. Liturgy's latest EP is As the Blood of God Bursts the Veins of Time, and their next album, 93696, will be out late March 2023. And so by the time this comes out, they'll most likely be starting the US tour, so go out and catch them if you're in the area. I mean, all to say, Ravenna, welcome to Baroque Sunbursts.
Hi. I didn't know the series is called Baroque Sunbursts. That's cool.
Good one. It's a tribute to this really minimal Mark Fisher piece. We'll try and get it up somewhere so people can get it. But it's this amazing bit of like feudalism rave and insurgent kinds of joy. And well, speaking of sort of artistic turns and insurgent kinds of joy, I guess let's begin with talking about, I guess, the origins of focusing on this early text of yours. And it's clear that it was meant to be a kind of a provocation to break out of this particular mode of playing black metal. This, you call it Hyperborean, and this longest kind of, let's say, mayhem burzum axis. And one of the ways you've tried to problematize it is through the static nature of its aesthetic. Black metal is seen as fundamentally nihilistic, and its main rhythmic technique of conveying the intensity of its emotion is the blast beat. So I guess to start off, what did you find to be so problematic about that way of conveying musical intensity, or what the limits of it in that Hyperborean or Norwegian mode of practicing it?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's the directly musical aspect of it, and then there's the sort of cultural aspect, and those are always kind of braided together in ways that are hard to untangle, especially in rock music. I mean, part of it was like, it was never a rejection exactly of Hyperborean black metal, but like an intensification of it. And so like I grew up in like a punk community, sort of art punk. And what attracted me to black metal when I encountered it was that it seemed to be a rejection in a way of like consumerist counterculture, where you're sort of making gestures that have this like moral or political dimension, but you're actually just consuming an identity. Like the black metal was somehow tuning out of the whole they're tuning out of modernism as such, or like they're further away from ideology than a lot of musical scenes that I sort of saw as kind of fooling themselves or something like that. But the thing with black metal is that it's reactionary. And so much like, I mean, it's a little bit similar to maybe the way that Deleuze and Guattari talk about what religion is or something, that like, there's this immediate kind of re-territorialization that happens with black metal, where you're like, all right, I'm rejecting sort of modernist, neoliberal, whatever, modernist nihilism, but then we just go back into like racism and tradition and family, and or not the family really, but like, so like it, so the idea was to kind of, they maybe like the first generation of black metal didn't quite have the courage to like pursue the essence of black metal as far as it wanted to carry itself, and that they were kind of falling short of like transcendental black metal, which would be a more direct experience of becoming. And the burst beat it partly performs that by executing phase transitions all the time, where you're sort of not in one state. Anyway.
I mean, we can unpack the burst beat a little. So the way I understood it, and cards on the table list, I did write like an extended commentary on this piece, like during the pandemic, which I never did send to Ravenna. But
right, which is how we
just to So the problem with the blast beat to some extent is its unending repetition. It kind of becomes static in that way. It becomes a static, kind of dulls itself, and it becomes more reactionary the more it tries to reach this height of musical experience, because the closer it gets there, the further it gets away. And so the burst beats, we can hear this, listeners, for anyone who listens to the music, really, is it made predominantly about this idea of ascending and descending, these accelerations and decelerations, the idea that rather than sort of, as Kant says about Plato, just taking off your wings and flying purely out, you land back on the other side and you can affirm the very finitude of that experience, rather than constantly like trying to shed the life of everything and trying to rid it all to reach pure intensity. Rather, you're affirming the finitude through these periodic dynamics of life. I mean, you once in the piece say it's solar. It affirms the periodics of rhythm.
Yeah, I sort of associate the blast beat with like Hegelian bad infinity or something.
Exactly, yeah.
Or, because keep in mind that the blast, because there's also this, like I think of the technique, but then I think of a sort of world historical destiny of music as it relates to world history as such. And so that metal is evolving and becoming more intense and faster. So it's accelerating. And so the blast beats, people sometimes forget this, that like the reason there's a blast beat is because it's like a rock and roll beat that is really fast. And like, it's sort of like thrash is kind of faster than like regular heavy metal, and black metal is that. And like, but it's so fast that it sort of is no longer a rock beat anymore. It's like a hum. And that's fine, but it's like a threshold that has to be crossed. You can't get faster than it, basically. And so, and if you're stuck in it, that's unhealthy. Whereas the burst beat passes between different states. So it's not just that it's accelerating and decelerating, but in using the logic of like intensive quantity. So it's kind of fluffy the way we actually do it, but like the idea would be that there's there's actually there are different beats that the burst beat is comprised of, and you can think of it like one is like steam and one is like liquid and one is like solid, and that it's sort of passing between, because it's not just getting faster and slower.
What I find most interesting, it's really striking to listen to for someone who may not be familiar with the differences in the rhythm patterns in liturgy versus in like traditional black metal, and really on either side of the Atlantic or whatever, is literally the presence of an accelerando. When you hear like God of Love is probably my favorite example, probably my favorite liturgy song as well, but particularly for its representation of intensity not as the potential for subjective finitude that comes in line when everyone is listening to this the exact same way, would be the goal of something that's as fast as possible but as uniform as possible, that it creates this sort of particularity of subjective experience rather than an affirmation of the refractory potential of subjective experience. Because what I find so interesting about the way that the burst beat works is that it works similar to a lot of modernist symphonic composition, to where the repetition is just as much about getting to the downbeat as it is the way that you begin to hear not just like all of the subtones within one particular tone, but the way that where you're beginning in this rhythmic pattern, where it's ending, and then how you can even take it into further logical conclusions and how I think some modernist composers did, by attaching these portions of intensity as joints on other sort of movements or something along that line, if you will, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I like that you bring up the accelerandos, because that's the most obvious part of what the burst beat is or whatever. And I like that you connect it to classical music too, because that's really, really important to me and has become more and more important for liturgy. Like, we also use a lot of fermatas, which is where you pause for a minute and then come to the downbeat. And the structure of the compositions is rooted in sonata form. And I'm actually, I guess modernist classical music I love. I think of liturgy as being more informed by post-romantic classical music because it's tonal in a similar way. And I actually think there's something, it's kind of the most like trad thing about me and the band or whatever, is that I think there's actually something kind of special about the tonal classical system and like the way the keys, like the 12 equal tempered tones in the keys and modulating and that kind of thing. Like I kind of think that's like the highest form of music, and everything else is a bit decadent. That's kind of an overstatement, but like I think that if we have this, and politically, it's like we sort of have this problem with countercultural music, where it's like the libidinal nihilism of it kind of ends up just being captured, and so it's like, oh, let's do something more wild, and it's going scape or whatever, but it's actually part of the logic of capital, and like there's something about merging that with the formal features of trad classical music, the fermatas and the accelerandos, and the theme and variation. There's a lot more theme and variation in liturgy than like any of metal, and that's like healthy for the human spirit or something, because it's not just trad, so it's not just for like philharmonic customers or something, but it's kind of it's really part of the rock tradition for like kids to like or whatever, but it's also, it has a more cerebral quality to it. It isn't just cerebral for its own sake, but it's kind of, it just sort of has the flavor of like the Enlightenment or something, because that tonal system is from the same era as Kant and the revolutions and that kind of thing.
I want to ask you, actually I want to ask you something about this Enlightenment mode, because there's definitely seems to be a somewhat of a shift or a balancing that happens between, say, the early text of Transcendental Black Metal and this more recent text about the Screaming Song that you sent us in draft. Whereas there's this tension between, as you say, between Kant and Bataille, between the idea you have the freedom from this idea that you can take the brakes off, you can accelerate, you can fully deterritorialize out into the atmosphere. And then we've all seen how that goes. You turn to Nick Land, so that doesn't work. And you have this purely Kantian mode of the freedom too, which is this very dutiful, very sort of hyper rationalist mode, which doesn't want to fall back into a pure libidinality. And I just want to ask how you sort of try to bring those two together, not only in the mode of philosophical thought, but also through the mode of course, music, through these areas of the bel canto and the rock music, how you bring forward with these two different styles, enlightenments and increasingly accelerating postmodern into this idea of kind of not so much of because you say that music is non-conceptual, but to accept a demonstration of these interweaving modes of free play.
Yeah, or an execution of them, or something like an instance. An effective instance or something. Yeah. I mean, I like, in some ways, that's what I was just talking about. Like, it's one thing I'll say is that I find that it's not very, somehow like the way we're describing it, it sounds kind of obvious. Like, oh, wouldn't you want to have both freedom from and freedom to? But like, that's not very common. Like, usually people kind of choose one silo or another. They're a rationalist, or they're a materialist, or they're kind of all in with these two poles are kind of there in all these different sort of modes. And so it's a real just compositional challenge for me to bring them together in a way that's non-cringe also, because that like it's a very dangerous place to be, because it's very easy for it to be uncool, and like somehow I think a more rationalist mode has going for it that it's kind of like arrogant, and that makes it cool. But if you're combining it, it's like, oh, high and low, like Vinsky techno or something, like it doesn't work. But like, so and it's a fairly intuitive process, but like, it's like, how do I bring these things together and make it kind of seamless? And I think that the idea is that the metaphysics underlying it is Trinitarian. So I'm not a materialist or an idealist, or a dualist. Like I believe that there are three persons of the Trinity, and that those can be described in a number of ways, which a lot of German idealism kind of sees the same thing, but like in that, yeah. So to be kind of aligned with the absolute would sort of require an integrated synthesis of those things in the same kind of paradoxical way as like Christ also being both human and divine, or something like that.
Is there what about the connection to opera as a sort of a mode for this? I know that you've been sort of very intentional about how the creation, origin, and the alimonies is something that's explicitly opera, is as a way of sort of the way that I described it. It stood out to me as an attempt to describe some kind of convergent phenomena, i.e., a God with many faces and attributes, of God of both and no gender. And I thought most interesting is the indescribable fourth, the inactual component of this. I've been describing it as X in my notes. Whereas opera has this ability to, I know we just talked about, the decadence of modernism, but there's this really interesting opera by Steve Reich that I like called The Cave, which is just this, for people who aren't familiar with it, it's literally an opera describing about the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron in Palestine. And it's an attempt to use these almost mathematical descriptive, artistic descriptive means to describe a convergent phenomena between the Abrahamic traditions. And I'm interested in how everything that you just talked about a minute ago relates to your application of specifically opera as a form, maybe particularly in Origin of the Alimonies, if any of that makes sense.
Yeah, I didn't know The Cave was about that, actually. I'm aware of that Steve Reich piece, but I've never just had time with it before. I think that the convergence of Abrahamic traditions is a cool topic. Yeah, I mean, when I think of opera, or when I consider my work to be opera, there's a number of versions of opera that it's participating in. So there is Aryan music drama, and in some ways, for Origin of the Alimonies in particular, the structural feature of music drama, or the structure of music drama, was kind of the structuring principle of that, where there's sort of story unfolding and the flow of the music is pretty linear, and it's just sort of it's just sort of like the musical analog of like intensities. Like there aren't really songs or whatever. But then Wagner saw his opera as not just works of musical theater, but has a sort of vision for humanity, right? So like a
totalizing,
a modernist religion, right? So a religion authored through an artist. So it's a total work of art. In some sense, my project as a whole, in having a musical domain, a philosophical domain, which Wagner didn't really have, or not really an original one. I don't know. I think he probably thought that his philosophy was as original as most people think that mine is. But I think I'm a more significant philosopher relative to my time than Wagner was. Because he was just like misreading Schopenhauer or whatever. But like, and then a dramatic component that, so yeah, anyway, there would be a sort of total art that would, a vision of the future of humanity that is also kind of executing that through being a work. And then I'm also interested in avant-garde notions of opera found more in the art world, like the work of Joseph, where like the kind of things that maybe like Kanye does or whatever, like the sort of opera as social sculpture, opera as kind of an intervention in the cultural field that in a sort of surprising or traumatizing way, where it's a total work, not in a particularly musical sense at all, even though you might be a musical artist. And I don't know, I've kind of sought controversy a lot less in recent times. I think that used to be sort of more of an ethics for me. It was to sort of go against the grain of what people would feel comfortable with. But now that kind of seems tiresome.
There's only so many people in Burzum t-shirts you can rile up before the reactions get a bit boring. I mean, I was only like, it's been like 4. I mean, like, God, I must have been like 40 when Aesthetica came out, and I remember just being surrounded on metal forums with people just screaming. I was like, this is fucking sick. I mean, I get with people moaning it, but I remember at one point when I was doing some writing on this, I remember writing as like a little preface, basically saying to black metal fans, like, don't get mad. You can read books, it's fine. We can do a bit of Nietzsche. You guys love Nietzsche. I mean, just to move through this idea of the Gesamt, called the total work of art. And you mentioned this like a buzzword, which is the absolute earlier. And what would you say there's a sort of a relation of dramatic presentation or representation of an idea of the absolute through the kind of the total work of art you're trying to provide? And I guess sort of underlying this question, I guess, is also another question, I guess, about the extent to which German idealism is influencing sort of what you're doing. Because to me, I see a lot of Schelling in it. And I do know you do read Schelling occasionally. I think you do read like I remember once you spoke about the Weltalter at some point, and I remember reading this amazing quote from the Weltalter. It says, "Who can unveil the secret birthplace of existence? Think. Have you ever enjoyed those rare moments of such blissful and perfect fulfillment, when the heart desires nothing, when you could wish these moments to remain eternally as they are, and when they actually are like an eternity to you?" When he's describing this sort of grand cosmic drama, and of course music for him is incredibly powerful, but he's doing it under this Trinitarian idea of 3 different potencies of God before the creation of the world. And I just wanted to ask, how do you see totality and absoluteness as exemplified through this trinity of music, art, and
Well, I mean, so to step back, Schelling is. I really like Schelling's Freiheitsschiff, especially. And his theology. Like that's such a short book, but it's so dense, and I don't know how I know that specific one. My knowledge of his work is fairly spotty. There's a couple that I know really well, and that's the one I know best. But I pretty much accept his theology wholesale. And but to step back, also as a philosopher, I am very attracted to explicit systematic philosophy, which is something that distinguishes German idealism from a lot of contemporary thought too, where you sort of build conceptual. You try to account for everything with a concept, you know what I mean? And like there's not a lot left to the imagination. So much contemporary philosophy is either specialized if it's more analytic, or it's. I think that's sort of seen as a kind of naive thing to try to do, or something like that. But so that's Aristotle too, of kind of happening. Okay, here's my theology, here's my metaphysics, here's my physics, here's my ethics, here's my eschatology, and here's how they all fit. I think that is like philosophy's essence, is to be like that kind of. And I'm hesitant to sort of try to turn philosophy into something else. And one of the nice things about doing music and philosophy together is to kind of let music make up for what philosophy lacks, rather than try to make philosophy like more musical or more artistic or something. So that's like one advantage of my approach or whatever. And like in terms of how it's instantiating the absolutes, I mean, in some sense or another, like it kind of sounds ham-fisted to put it like this, like the absolute is comprised of like will, intellect, and imagination. And so I map those onto music, philosophy, and drama, but in their world historical coevolution. So like working with contemporary musical forms as they're sort of pushing towards the threshold of like originality, and attempting to kind of, as a kind of an engineering project, to like be aware of sort of the current state of the art in these domains, and then also sort of construct something that doesn't exist comfortably in any one of them, and actually makes most sense on its own terms. That's like the highest freedom that a sort of creator would be capable of in our time, where then you're not, and again back to capital, that then you're not getting reterritorialized, because you're not, and it's still like people like liturgy doesn't really make sense to people for the most part. Like even though it's not controversial now the way it was, it's still kind of like people, you sort of have to approach it from the inside to really see the full perspective on what it is.
The ideas of the transcendent, the idea of mysticism, as well as systems, I think for a lot of people actually does feel counterintuitive, which if you're familiar with theology and the history of theology, we're systematizing over here.
Yeah, like, yeah, it's so funny. People are like, oh, like religion is the opposite of reason. It's just like, no, religion is the birthplace of reason, my friend. Like,
yeah,
sorry, yeah,
no, absolutely. Like, it's funny. You say exactly that, and the question, one of the questions that I had is that throughout your work, you've developed various systems, and I said new situations for the use of religious language as a mean for encapsulating, religious language alongside of music and the production of those art forms, and like we were talking about opera earlier being very important and key to it, but as a way for encapsulating perhaps some degree of the transcendence in subjective necessity as this participation in eternity, really as a participation in God and moving toward heaven beyond the wall is the language that I've heard you use before, which I think is very compelling. And it reminds me of that movement itself actually reminds me of Schelling and this this unfolding after church idea, which I also just kind of generally accept in my own personal research interests in itinerance in preaching and asceticism. And then I think what you're describing here is what it means to seek as a mystic, which I brought a quote from Gershom Scholem where he says that a mystic is someone who is, who has been favored with an immediate and to them real experience of the divine of ultimate reality, or who at least strives to attain such experience, may come through sudden illumination and may be the result of long and elaborate preparations and ways of participating. I'm just interested to hear you talk about maybe speaking to any of these ideas of how transcendence has kind of consistently played a role in liturgy's music, and as well as if, like, I know that you've talked about used Kabbalah as a language to describe the transcendental recently. If you just want to speak to what it means to construct a system in religious language, and if that is how to encapsulate these sort of ideas of transcendence and subjectivity that you've done.
Yeah, fun question. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff in that question. I hope I can remember to get to it. That Scholem quote was cool. Yeah, when I used the term the transcendental, I mean it in multiple ways. And I think originally, yeah, I mean there's the sort of there's the two main post-Kantian versions of the transcendental. One, the sort of the faculties, basically, right? The transcendental unity about perception as just the frame of experience that can't be experienced within experience, but can be sort of speculated about as like a form of psychology. And then there's the kind of materialist intensification of that, where the transcendental is the space where theories of the transcendental can show up or something. So it's sort of underlying a particular instance of the transcendental. There's sort of a sort of historical field or something like that. And the version of the transcendental that I'm most interested now, though, in the most religious version of it is actually like very, very dogmatic, very like dogmatic in the sense of like there being, say, in the Christian church, dogmas that are simply true. And like, I think that there was a point in the history of philosophy. It was weird with Kant because like Kant's project was sort of to like shrink philosophy, and like, but no one ever really reads them like that, really. It's sort of, they want to turn philosophy into everything. But like, I kind of think that, I mean, as a Christian, not everyone has to be a Christian, but like as a Christian, like that there are statements in whatever, like the Nicene Creed, that in some sense are, so they're neither artistic nor rational, but they're just sort of true, and they come from God, and that like that in some sense, like the noumenon is actually populated with like angels and things like that, in like actually in a way that is much closer to what a medieval theologian would have thought. I don't really see that as naivete to assume that to be true, and I think that prayer and meditation can be avenues for contacting. Though, I mean, admittedly, there's something postmodern about me saying that. Like it's like I'm aware that, and I don't know, like it's kind of not serious. I mean, I can't be like fully trad in that way, but like I think just as my relationship to philosophy and life and spirituality has developed, that's just sort of more and more the sense that I have, and I haven't like there's this idea that there's something unsophisticated about taking that to be true, but I can't really tell what the basis is for that. So in some sense, the transcendental is just like God consciousness and in communion with, like Christ and angels and Mary.
Yeah. All things seen and unseen being this sort of a statement that carries weight beyond the simple utterance of the statement, but whatever exists beyond that particular utterance.
Yeah, and that there's like a battle between good and evil being carried out over the course of world history that's like undecided. That they're like God wants the world to get better, and there are forces of evil that should be fought, and but that has to be redefined with every generation. And so, because the annoying thing about religion is that most forms of religion are evil, in the present time. Like that's what it's. Most like evangelical fundamentalism is like, I see it as a fake religion. It's not real. My research for that is I love Bergson's two sources of morality and religion, where there's sort of the closed version and the open version. So, and I'm always kind of reconstructing themes from my favorite Christian and Islamic theologians to fit into Bergson's open version of religion, and then that affirms civil rights and egalitarianism and things like that, which is again not something that is that common. Like I think when you see discourse on the internet, like if anyone says like, oh, I'm a Christian now or whatever, like that goes with this whole like that means that I've rejected civil rights politics and oh fuck wokeness, and like, but that's not even just fully naive religion. That's sort of being some kind of culture industry aware person who then turns to religion, but then still you choose this like reactionary stance in aligning with it. But I think that true religion is inherently a mix between progressive and radical, and that it's important to have trad elements to sort of strengthen the soul and like especially the attention span, and that goes back to classical music. Like I think that to have a vision, to have an ethics for art and music where it's sort of challenging and kind of challenges your attention, and there's a lot of information to absorb, and like the more historically aware you are, the more you'll understand it and appreciate it. Like having that kind of like stance towards culture that like a professor would be proud of or whatever that's a little bit reactionary, and so I like that, but just not hate.
Well, when we think about time, I think about time and like the Marxists like Benjamin as well as E.P. Thompson, their sort of like aggressive attack on this homogenized, empty use of time in contemporary capitalism that's mostly associated with filtering all experiences through the effects of capitalist experiences. And basically you could take it to the sort of mother brain, the subconscious, the dream work of the subconscious of the mother brain of capitalism. And in there is this vacuum through which that like time no longer is of your own. And so dedicating yourself to a craft, like a string instrument, I play cello, and it took you an hour a day, every day since I was a kid. I haven't done that in a long time because I don't play music professionally or anything, but like that all the way through college was an internalized sense of reclaiming something for art when I have to spend all the rest of my time like making lattes for people I hate, or like cutting grass to make money so I can eat food and stuff. I can actually sit there and fall into something. It feels, I know it's not natural or whatever, but it feels like a reversion. Again, there's the dangerous language, but it's countercurrent. It's not reactionary in that, like, I'm not trying to, personify this imagined version of the past, but instead we're just not letting history be caught in this feedback loop anymore and letting it breathe into the present. And I think that that's cool. And I think that's why people should play music, and why I encourage people who I know who want to play music that absolutely you should, and absolutely you can learn how to do it. I think that's really special.
Yeah, the immersion in crafts as non-alienated labor or whatever is something very, it's just very healthy. I don't know. I was just at band practice, as I was saying earlier, and like I don't really like, we have band practice once a week, even when we're not touring, and like it really going through the process of playing the music. I don't know what I would do without it. It's not like I really need to do it, and it does just kind of, it's like, humans, and this is something that like you can find in a lot of self-help books, that sort of just humans just kind of have this expressive need or whatever, and like, if you can think you have so many problems, and maybe you do, but like that if you sort of find a place for really sort of focusing effort in the aesthetic realm, that it's a path of freedom. And that's obviously a super German idealism thing. Every German idealist basically says that. They sort of talk in such a weird way that it's not always easy to get that's sort of that they're basically talking about this like self-help thing. But the aesthetic, like Fichte or whatever, the like aesthetic unfolding or whatever is the absolute, is God. Speaking of Fichte, have you ever encountered Fichte's son?
No, who's Fichte's son?
His name is Emanuel Fichte, and he seems really. I've just been reading a bit. So basically, part of why I like him is that he's a dogmatic theist, and so he was he's Fichte's son, and he studied under Hegel, and he was sort of immersed in this German idealism world, and he uses that language for his system, but he reacts against it. He's a trap basically, and he's very interested in improving the immortality of the individual soul, sort of using Hegel's language and then sort of critiquing it on that basis. So it's this. It's not super well known at all, but it's pretty. I recommend it. I'm reading one of his books right now.
It's good because I'm currently going for this post-Hegelian. I say post-Hegelian. It's like 10 years after he dies, of milieu of some of Schelling's later lectures, where he goes to this idea that actually Hegel's just doing negative philosophy. He's just doing these rational limits of reason. But the conditions of possibility, the dark grounds of under heaven of the transcendental, are these various potencies of personality, which are all potencies of God, but sort of this magic formula Deleuze and Guattari say, monism equals pluralism, where you can have this idea of a religio, a religion, a thing that binds, at the same time as you can have this as an open whole rather than this restrictive mode of it. Yeah, said the open versus closed versions of religious morality, or morality in general, that we get in Bergson. And I guess, do you see? Where isn't there how does the notion of community intersect with this idea of the total work of art, or even the performance? So, if I've been to a liturgy show. Kyle will go to a liturgy show soon. But for the audience, is there a community? Is there sort of a communal dissolving of these bounds of individuality at the same time as there's a sort of recommunion there? In the liturgy show, is there an aspect of communion going on through this presentation of the total artwork? Because eventually, someone's generation, eventually sort of where you sort of like over intensify, overcode you. Just sort of, I just sort of spill out eventually.
Well, you tell me.
You know, I think it is. I don't know. Is that the intention of the presentation? I think to have is there an aspect of communion to it, because there's this third underlying potency between music and philosophy of the messianic. I was wondering, is there a Eucharistic sense to the musical performance?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why it's the name of the band. It's a church spirit. Yeah, it's an effort to bring heaven down to earth, and I think that the performances pull that off. I mean, a lot of shows you go to. I don't know. It's weird to talk about your own performances, but I think a lot of shows you go to, and it's like, oh, cool. There's some guy playing the bass, and there's a singer, and they're hot or whatever. And I mean, I think that's great. But I think my experience of a band is we bring in a lot of sincere, a pathos of sincerity and of intensity that it's really fun for me. It's even fun just to play it in practice, but it's really fun for me when people are there and they know the music, and it's some kind of frenetic version of a worship service, bringing heaven down to earth.
That's really important in the dynamic, in an eschatological dynamic across all kinds of Christian traditions, is the declarative social intervention that theological language, for example, can absolutely give, and that is music has been an avenue for literally for thousands of years. And when you think about the idea of practicing, of holding things in the Book of Acts, eventually holding things all in common, with the idea in the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus is approached by his disciples in anticipation of imminence, and when is the kingdom of God going to be here? And he's just like, you dumbass, the kingdom of God it's in your midst. It's entos, in the midst of you. And so it has this it at the very least says that the tools by which we might critique or complicate the sort of isolating and negatively individualizing unto this sort of, we were talking about capitalism earlier, and for example, individualizing you into this perfectly realized particular consumer, rather than the sort of ethos of liturgical formation, but also of the history of heavy aggravated guitar music and heavy music and stuff as this participatory activity that we all, I'm sure, literally grew up on in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I love to imagine in having an eschatological vision of imagining heaven as basically being, just scaling up a really great rock concert or something, and finding cruel principles for society as a whole. It would make life like that all the time, or a really great classical music work where every moment counts. Well, I like to say all suffering, no suffering goes unredeemed, or whatever. So that there are moments of discord, but that there are opportunities for learning or whatever. And I kind of think maybe that's why music exists, is that it's sort of a clue into what heaven could be like once we sort of cross the technological singularity, and or just a higher and higher ratio of the infinite to the finite, where the infinite specifically means moral conduct, actually, activity that is animated by infinite eternal values, which means that it's not satisfying base pleasures of either identity or whatever else, but that it's like when you're being motivated by the infinite, what you're doing is expanding, and you're sort of doing in doing it, you're changing something about the way that it's done, or something. There's something inherently unfolding about the infinite.
You mentioned the singularity there. Actually, I did have a question about this technological aspect, because I recently watched your talk with, among other people, Reza Negarestani, and at one point you said that Neorationalism, exemplified in this book of Negarestani's Intelligence and the Spirit, which is this Hegelian attempt at AI, Kyle's got it. I've got it somewhere. It's too hard for me to read. I don't know Karnak very well. But I mean, you said at one point that Neorationalism, this Hegelian sort of German idealist take on artificial general intelligence, should shed its secular pretensions. What do you mean by that? I mean, how does that sort of idea of technological singularity or evolving, progressing intelligence or intensifying intelligence build into this heavenly mode of eschatology, or this Hegelian aspect?
Oh yeah,
Hegelian, is it pronounced? Sorry.
I pronounce it different ways. Sometimes I say Hylogen also. Yeah, I mean, Reza's book is funny this way because I feel like there's a kind of very non-secular core that is kind of secret or something, and that is sort of covered with all this technology and science stuff. But like, that book it's a vision. First of all, it's an eschatological vision for human destiny, which people don't necessarily realize. But also, like, it's once you are endorsing being animated by like the true and the good and the beautiful, you've sort of returned to the domain of pre-critical philosophy. You know, like medieval philosophy. So that's another meaning of the transcendentals, right? In medieval philosophy, truth, goodness, beauty, and justice, or forms that are sort of a higher sphere of forms than the regular forms, and they're the divine ones, and they don't show up as instances the way that dogs or whatever do, but they both apply to the lower forms, and then they also apply to things in the world without themselves being things. And you can, I think that something interesting in that book is kind of playing with the relationship between the dogmatic transcendentals and science, and sort of the way that like articulating sort of computer agency and norms in very specific ways is refining and developing our conception of what truth, goodness, beauty, and justice are. But I think that, like, I don't know, to me, that's a pre-critical project in a lot of ways, because I think that, I don't know, maybe critical or post-critical philosophy sort of doesn't accept that truth, goodness, beauty, and justice are metaphysical principles.
I mean, it's weird. It's like they kind of double back on each other because they're regulative in sort of this post-critical or Kantian mode. But what is the regulative? It's the cybernetic. So there's this dual paradigm of emergence happening here. It's where you could, go back to Schelling. He takes Kant and he says, okay, now we need to go to Plato's Timaeus, because now we just need creation, and we've got Kant. We just need creation, and it's all sort of coming together. So I think Reza somewhat knows this. I mean, the last book he put out with Bouquet was Chronosis, which is where time just goes, I'm just going to exist now and create everything. And then we go, the time is this superhero of being, and it's, I mean, I did put it on whilst listening to The Hark the first time. So, okay, here's a system of transcendental Kabbalah. Here is time coming through like a superhero. And it begins with a bloody Schelling quote, that book. I mean, it does intersect quite a bit. So, I mean, it was great to hear about sort of how sort of your thought and Negarestani's thought is interacting.
Yeah, I love that book, Intelligence and Spirit. I think it's the most interesting philosophical, or most valuable philosophical project around in recent times. I mean, because I was very accelerationism pilled for a while, and it was kind of really just starting to become disturbing to me. And I sort of really needed a book like Intelligence and Spirit. I was sort of waiting for it to come out as like he was writing the essays leading up to it.
Well, this is going out on Zero Books. This is accelerationism at its home, its cradle of civilization. Oh, sorry, Kyle.
No, that's true. Technically, that is true. No, I find like Reza, there's that aspect of Reza that I think is really interesting, which we could I like to colloquially refer to as just as his Neoplatonism, which I've always found really compelling and interesting. I sometimes struggle to understand him, but I feel like I've understood him more by approaching him through one of his contemporaries, who I've been really lucky enough to interview a couple of times. His name is Jason Babak Mohageg, and he wrote a few, but he just put out another book for Zero, and is going to put out a sequel to his book Omnicide. And in the interview that we got to do about Omnicide Part 2, what I found most compelling and what helped me kind of understand this sort of like the way that we're thinking through systems in this conversation, and I think that leads directly back toward Ravenna, the kind of systems that you've been building using religious and theological language, is this idea of the, in Omnicide Part 2, he has this extended sort of like post note kind of thing where he goes into the supposed 99 names of God in the Islamic tradition. And then he goes on to the whole sort of onus of his particular writing is about the both the value in the sort of like the value in extremes of experience. He writes entire books about darkness and night and stuff like that, and Omnicide as a philosophy of doom, basically mania as like as the sort of essence of destruction and the compulsion toward that destruction. But what I found so remarkable about everything that he says, and in general about what you've been putting out on your YouTube channel as well, which I think people should go and watch those essays if they're interested in the kinds of things that we've been talking about, is that there's an inherent like acknowledgement and gesture toward the esotericism that exists in the languages that we build, and that from the sort of very essence, the examples that I always use are Christian, but that's just from my upbringing and from my studies, but like even at its essence, the applications and uses of esotericism in Christianity in my opinion, are compelling ways of enunciating how those religious languages and systems can actually be beneficial to us. And I just find it interesting that Reza and Jason know each other and have collaborated frequently and stuff like that. As someone who looks to their work and applies it in this almost kind of Christian language or Christian religious framework for my own work, I don't know if that's something that speaks to what you've been doing recently, especially on.
Yeah, I've never read any of Jason's work, though I kind of keep meaning to. But your description of it sounded cool, and yeah, I mean, the relationship between religion and esotericism in a kind of dynamic where it brings out what is useful for us in religion or in esotericism. Like, I think it's important that to affirm that religion and esotericism are useful in some way. And then from there, you have all these choices about how to knit them together and how to knit them together with modernism too. And the reason that I choose a Christian approach, maybe reason is the wrong word, but like, is that, well, okay. So I'm very interested in the dialectical tension historically between Christianity and its heresies. So Christianity always evolved in relationship, especially to Gnosticism, forms of Gnosticism. And I read, maybe it's controversial to say, but I don't think it is at all, that like Hegel's system is like a Gnostic work of philosophy, and Nick Land's system is a Gnostic work of philosophy, in that usually Gnostic forms, they privilege knowledge of some kind over love and faith. And you sort of imagine that human history is this process that's going to go the way it's going to go no matter what. And the task of like Gnostic philosophy is to sort of become someone who knows. And so then you see the way the world is actually unfolding. And so then you can kind of affirm it and maybe help out rather than naively resisting it and being a bleeding heart or something like that. And like that, I think that produces kind of the coldness that I don't love in Land's version of accelerationism. And I think that Christianity has always identified that in earlier versions of Gnosticism and rejected it, because Christianity privileges faith in the resurrection of Jesus Christ over knowledge. So Gnostics see Christ as a bringer of knowledge. Christians see Christ as a divine sacrifice, and you have faith in the sacrifice. And then in having faith in the meaning of that sacrifice, Christ enters your heart, and you are more loving, and you're actually able to respond to God's will more effectively. And like, so, and that like the Gnostic version of that is divine in its own way, but it's like a dark version of the divine, basically. And so, yeah, I that kind of really ran me a little bit, but like, like basically that way of knotting together esotericism with religion is what is attractive to me. And then preserving, instead of having a Nietzschean approach where you imagine that human values are just part of the process, and that sort of the new eon will just have new values, the new beings will have, that we don't even know anything about or whatever, that like, in some sense, the transcendentals, like things like love and goodness, are in the most naive way that you would think of them, that like, that's what they are, and they're very valuable in being that, and like, that love is a real force that you shouldn't really translate into anything else, even though there are versions of love in different domains that are maybe seem like unlikely, that just like being loving is the main one.
I think you're totally right to say that there's a Hegelian sort of Landian sort of thing around this prioritization of intelligence over everything else, this gnosticization of it. Because ultimately for Hegel, Kojève points this out really well in his like lectures on Hegel, the idea that everything is only what it is insofar as it is within the mind's eye of the person who has absolute knowing. It's not the absolute. It's absolute knowing first and foremost. It's where you can get all these deflationary aspects, or how Hegel can say that in the aesthetics, the art is kind of, it's over, it doesn't fully express the freedom in the same way that conveniently Hegel's philosophy does, or Land's whole thing of basically affirming the worst thing that goes on at any one time because it's also a great play of natural selection. He has a god, he calls it God or nature's god. It's like this weird whole, I'm actually about to quote him for a second there, but I don't think he needs any more attention. But I think this is a really good way of putting it, especially in terms of the idea of community, and even this egalitarian sort of eroding of the distinction between religion and civil rights that you talked about. Because moving to this Trinitarian model in which difference is preserved yet suspended because they're all three different kinds of the same potency, put it in Schillingian terms. There are three potencies, and there's this indifference point, this divine absolute indifference point in which all differences are both suspended and preserved. It kind of brings the entire language into play. Schelling was a theosophist, and he says in the Weltals, like, yeah, philosophy's actually got it a lot easier than philosophy. It can know its object through a method, but this is the method I'm going to use. And I guess I know we've already passed, I guess to ask another question about the current epoch, I guess, is, do you think that there's like a contemporary rise or return to forms of religious ways of experiencing, or even religious ways of knowing, or non-typical epistemologies? Do you think there's that kind of turn happening right now? People are dissatisfied with the dominant Enlightenment ways of knowledge or knowing, and do you think there's going to be sort of a turn away from that? And there's clearly some dangers there. We can see like the whole integralist tradcaf, a particular part of New York kind of line, let's say. But do you think there's going to be a return to these kind of epistemologies, these kind of esotericisms, as postmodernism is kind of... Yeah, postmodernism is a boogeyman. I shouldn't really be saying that. In terms of modernist epistemologies have kind of reached their limits.
Yeah, I hate New York tradcafs so much. I don't hate them. I love them. I want to keep loving them until they learn to love themselves. I'm glad that in some ways, I'm glad that the kind of secular humanist hegemony is dissolving because I like religion so much. And I think that in some ways, it's just a positive, just egalitarian side effect of the dissolution of the power of legacy media or whatever. And because most people are religious, and there's no reason not to be. No one ever, like the New York Times never proved that like there's no God or something. And so that's great. And I think that there is this kind of arrogance or something of thinking of religion as something in the past that is. I was gonna mention arrogance in response to a previous point you were making, but I forget if it's connected. Oh, in terms of the Gnosticism, that it's sort of a way of, it's like, because it's not just, we're sort of beyond God, then it's also like, and we're beyond love too. Like love is naive or it's childish or something. But but then it's not that complicated. I just don't, then to identify like this civil rights movement as like, then to kind of scapegoat, like it's like people like love Gerard or whatever, like Fatcast or like it's Rene Girard is like, and like they use wokeness as like a scapegoat or something, and it's very hypocritical. I think that secular humanism is something to transcend and include, rather than to reject, and so it's just complicated because some of the things that are surfacing because of the dissolution of its power are evil, and the others seem evil because they threaten a power structure that we take for granted, and it's kind of hard to know which is which. Immanence can't know it all.
Every New York tradcaf, there is a liberation theologian waiting in the wings with an AK-47, ready to go into the jungle and take down the capitalist system.
A Unitarian with an easy.
Okay, I know we're already a bit over the hour. Kyle, you would think I don't want to keep you too long with that. Yeah, Kyle, you think so?
No.
All right. Okay. One last question.
I have 500 things, but like
do you have anything to say about liberation theology on this front, Kyle? So, I know that's sort of not to.
No, like I think liberation. The thing that I like the most about liberation theology is that is historicizing it, and that it has this like. It was given as a rise. It came from a necessity. In this exact same thing, it's actually the descriptive power of history, as always, coming through in clutch. Historicizing the particular neoliberal turn at that time, and then also alongside of the progress of elements of Latin American and Central American liberation theology, and then eventually literal guerrilla warfare in opposition to coups planned and executed by the CIA and that kind of a thing, is like. There's this, it's sort of like, I think maybe the difference of the problem now is that we have we're not, instead of we're trying to both denaturalize contemporary capitalism and reintroduce these ideas of like, no, not everything has, and always shall be, but things are in flux. And the way that the world is made, actually, this is what I think. I think that something that sort of works in liberation theology, as well as in the particular like Wesleyan tradition, like the evangelical kind of tradition that I was raised with, is that immanence is descriptive of the potential for the world to be right in recognition of the fact that the world is not right. Something is wrong, and that there are like that the drive within the self, like the collapsing within the self, isn't doing any work toward elevating or changing that particular self. It's the fact that we're placed within this tension in the self, and the fact that the world's fucked up. The world is not right is like the start of a speech of one of my like. It's a pretty normal speech from Eugene Debs' like early time with the rail workers. He was in Butte, Montana, I think. I brought it up on an episode of my show for Zero Books, specifically because to describe this idea that like I write about I'm writing a book about the utopian using a lot of these sort of the language that we've been describing today, as well as Walter Benjamin and Ernst Bloch. And I think it's all predicated on the sort of specific demands that we've made here. On the one hand, the recognition of the reemergence of these challenges to dominating social orders and the media apparatuses that constantly reinforce and duplicate them and allow them to change. And at the same time, the necessity toward giving rise to something new and placing
placing those ambitions, the ambitions beyond the wall, into the unfolding process of trying to bring heaven into earth. Basically, I think you're right in the way that you describe eschatological concerns and their relationship to the social, and that I think it's actually maybe more important than ever that we're reintroducing these particular ideas here and now. And there's no other place to introduce them besides here and now in this time and place, because it's where we are. So you see my blind dog running into stuff all behind me. My poor guy. He's okay.
He's actually blind?
Yeah, he's fully blind.
Oh, wow. Cute.
I'll find it. There he goes. He made it. But anyway, sorry. I blacked out for a second.
Yeah. Good stuff. I like it.
I mean, that was, I love it when carcass you get unzipped like this. It's the other book. Yeah, he's writing a book for Zero Books, folks. It's called Revival: The Return of Spirits, and it's going to be that for pages and pages. And it's, I mean, we might have. We should need to look at Zero Revival series, like just on like Thomas Muntzer, Gerard Winstanley. I'm just gonna round it off here, and I know we're reaching the. We've gone up for a little over an hour. I will say, Ravenna, thank you so much for coming on to Baroque Sunbursts, the first episode. And I mean, Liturgy will be on tour by the time this comes out. We have As Blood of God Burst the Veins of Time out now. We have 93-696 out at some point late March, so I can edit that in. And then, of course, the tour is starting in about a week. Go and see it. I mean, you'll have a religious experience. You don't even need to get very drunk. Like most gigs, you've got to have a few drinks, sort of settle in. No, you don't. So it all wash over you.
Yeah,
like take union.
It's best to be sober for it. Makes make sure your senses are as acute as possible. Yeah.
I'll learn from my mistakes.
We're going on tour through Canada to Chicago and back. It's just like a 10-day tour. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay.
Thanks so much for having me. That was a very enjoyable conversation.
See, absolute privilege. Thank you.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zero Books Today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zero has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.